In this video, I'll explore the crisis of resolving abuse as an adult. I'll leave looking at childhood abuse as a separate issue, although, of course, there tends to be an echo. Every child believes that the abuse that occurs to them is because they're unlovable, because they're a bad person, because that's the message they're receiving from the giants that they depend upon to survive. Every infant, every child, to some extent every adolescent without legal authority, is dependent on the giants around them. To an infant, every grown-up is a giant. To survive, to feel secure, to experience love and belonging, to meet self-esteem in the form of outside validation as an infant, to develop one's abilities, one's gifts, to bring them abundantly into the world and become part of something bigger. These human needs that we all share, we are in some degree of dependency, meaning, I may say I'm an independent person, but I didn't invent the clothing industry, nor did I design silversmithing, nor did I go into hat manufacturing, nor did I invent the English language or the financial system that we interdependently relate through in a capitalist culture. So we are all dependent to some degree on others, and to some degree in a state of isolation as an individual in relationship with the whole, with the larger culture. We are aware of that dependency. And if something isn't working out, instinctively we know we cannot change the world. We cannot redesign a culture to be more competent than it is. And so there's this default drive that says, if something's wrong, it's my fault. And this is unfortunate because, particularly in infancy and childhood, we are the only ones not at fault. We're in a dependent, helpless situation, and the competency of other people to love us, to whatever degree they are capable of, has absolutely nothing to do with us. We're just entering into a world that has a certain amount of competency and an inevitable amount of incompetency. When that incompetency is high, that is a shared incompetency. If you have incompetent parents, that has something to do with parents being parentally illiterate, not having the skills of parenting. And that has something to do with being culturally illiterate, meaning we're a culture that gives anyone the right to have children, regardless of how much overwhelming data is present that says this person is incompetent to raise a child. They're incompetent to take care of themselves, let alone their partner and an innocent child. So we are all complicit as a culture in every facet of what goes on for individuals, and never more so than the infants, the children that we usher into the world through our culture. Now, as an adult in a psychologically illiterate culture, meaning we don't study psychology in kindergarten, middle school, high school, college, at work, in marriage. The most important science of a species as humans, the awareness of the self and all of the different dynamics and algorithms of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, which create identity. It is the single most potent and relevant science that there is. So in an incompetent cult or culture, we don't spend a single hour learning anything about it. In fact, we have many hours based on shame and ignorance and fear, learning the exact opposite of effective science. And, our parents were raised in that same environment. As adults that are not taught to question the culture and look at elements of cultural design, to a large extent, we default to the self-centered messages of an infant to a child that says it's all my fault. If the giants are incapable of loving me, I must be unlovable. And that's true in the sense that to be lovable, you need people capable of loving you. That's all you require to be lovable, is you need people capable of love. Every human being, particularly born in the innocence of infancy, is lovable by a capable, competent adult. But if there are no capable, competent adults around us capable of love, we are unlovable, not because there's anything wrong with us, but because there's something very wrong in a cult that doesn't even teach a cogent definition of the word, but instead crosswires it. I hit you because I loved you. I criticized you because I'm worrying about you. I'm doing what's... We're so confused, and we dump all of this confusion on the child that blames themselves. The child that blames themselves and unquestionably or unquestioningly moves into grown-uphood often retains the same unquestioned beliefs of unlovability that never got explored and never got owned. Your government, your parents, your teachers didn't come and apologize and say, we really don't know what we're doing here. And you're carrying the bag, so give it back to us. It's, if it's anyone's fault, it's ours. And so the cycle of ignorance and fear continues. That being said, the people most abused in childhood tend to be more abused as grown-ups than people who weren't abused, partly because identities, patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being perpetuate. They continue unless they meet a force or a technology capable of intervening, questioning those thoughts and feelings and patterns of identity. And we do not teach transcendence in a materialistic culture, meaning that there is a self that is more important than the garment of the identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we all wear, but that is not essentially us. So when we are abused, again, as grown-ups, often fitting nicely with people that echo some face of the original abuser. It's known in psychology, for example, that men will often marry their mother, someone with certain traits there, and women will often marry their father. Patterns continue in unconscious default until a culture is capable of examining and redesigning the pattern, which ironically, in fear-based, shame-based culture never happens because we cling to the identity of the cult, of the parts of us that we've gotten to know and confused as our self. The self is the one capable of witnessing, of changing, of evolving, of questioning the clothing, the identity, which is a pattern that ideally helps us survive, feel secure, meet our personal human needs. So how to respond when we find ourselves, unconsciously or consciously reenacting an abuse pattern? Because in many cases, victims will gravitate towards people that remind them, that are familiar. There's a safety in familiarity. The devil I know is worse than the devil I don't know. And you feel familiar. Where does the word come from? You feel like family. In other words, I'm drawn to you because you're like my mother, my father, my uncle, etc. There's a challenge in an abuse cycle because an abuse cycle, the absence of good use, an abuse cycle, is one that communicates usually a message. And the message is, one of the messages in abuse is, I have no value, you have no value. Now, this is a dis-ease. It's a painful message. If I believe I don't have value, and so I allow or participate in some way in my abuse, and you believe that I don't have value, and so you participate in abusing me, then everyone at the table agrees that I have no value. I behave and think and feel, etc., that I have no value. That's my identity. My pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being has elements, has undertones of a message or overtones that say, I'm not very valuable. And my abuser agrees with me. The pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being of the abuser is, you don't have much value. That's why I'm abusing you. And the culture is agreeing as well, right? Because the culture is not intervening. There's a cycle in any abuse pattern here. There's a cycle in any abuse pattern that involves the witness, the victim, and the perpetrator. And they're all part of the circle. The witness, those around us in the culture, have the most mass. They're the biggest part of the pattern. So the culture that allows children to be abused and allows adults to be abused and just turns its head. The culture is the most potent, meaning it's the biggest part. It's very difficult for abuse dynamics to continue if on the news, if your president, if your mayor, all says, this abuse is happening, we want to know about it, and it's not right, and we're going to own it and not let it happen. So who's being abused, who's abusing, how can we participate so that this changes? It's just proactive, intervention. Let's teach people psychology. Let's teach people relationship dynamics. Let's teach people conflict resolution. Let's teach people about feelings. Let's basically move from ignorance and shame to literacy and competency. So the culture, of course, could intervene at any point. It's just not doing it. And by doing so, it's sending the strong message, you have no value. If we didn't teach pilots a 6-year course on how to fly 747s, they'd all crash. But the culture says, no, 747s, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars. They're valuable. So we're going to intervene. There has to be a school, and you have to learn to fly this plane, and you have to prove this, and you have to go to school and get licensed because planes have value. Children, just wing it. You'll figure it out practicing on an infant. It's a message of apathy and valuelessness. So your cult is saying you have no value. Your perpetrator is saying you have no value. Your identity, your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is saying you have no value. And the past, you look into the past, in almost all cases, People who are abused in adulthood, they have a past that gave them the same message: you have no value. So that's the crisis of value. Everyone in the dynamic is going along with this message of you have no value. And that's why this will just keep happening. That's just the way the world is. So that's the dis-ease. Now, how do you as the individual, since the cult is not doing its job, since the abuser is typically an abuse survivor that got the message they have no value, and so they're trying to give that dis-ease to somebody else. And in a fight, flight, freeze dynamic, in a sociopathic dynamic of fear and scarcity, the abuser will always target somebody vulnerable. You can interview serial killers, you can interview rapists, and they can tell who will not fight back. And generally speaking, a bully will pick on someone who is unable or unwilling to defend themselves. That's generally how a bully picks its target. Bullies don't like to be punched in the nose by people bigger than them. And so they look around and say, oh, there's an isolated kid. There's a vulnerable person who the cult is not taking care of. Meaning the teachers aren't looking out for them, the other classmates are judging them, whatever. There's a vulnerable target that everyone is saying has no value. I'll pick on them because I'll win, right? And then I'll get to transfer some of my shame and misery onto someone more vulnerable than myself because I'm bigger, right? So I'll win. In a sociopathic dynamic, the perpetrator attacks someone in a dynamic where they're going to win because they're bigger. That's why we call them bullies. In childhood, you're pretty much screwed in an incompetent culture because it's very difficult for a child to own the responsibility of saying, no, I am valuable. My parents may not be treating me valuably. My teachers may not be treating me valuably. My government doesn't give a damn. There's no one coming around and asking how they can help, etc. Nobody's caring, but I know I have value. How do you know you have value when you get hit and humiliated repeatedly? It's an overwhelming burden of the culture's incompetence that's being put on the most vulnerable people. Now, as an adult, or at least as a grown-up, adulthood is, a process that occurs through a certain amount of initiation and transcendence of the cult identity, which is not taught. So many of us are not adults and have no practical means within a materialistic, psychologically illiterate culture to become adults. So how do we work on this issue? Well, we are part of the cycle, meaning the culture is saying we have no value. The abuser is saying we have no value. No one's intervening. And we're saying we have no value by participating in the abuse. Now, as I say, it's not appropriate to discuss this and talk this either with people in a regressed, traumatized state. So if you're in a regressed, traumatized state, you're not in a position to do much with what I'm talking about. I apologize on behalf of the culture, on behalf of the abusers. I apologize. It's a dysfunctional culture. It's not your fault. If you have some degree of rational control of what's going on in your life, if you are not entirely regressed, you are then in a situation to look at this cycle. The abuser says, I have no value. I say I have no value. The culture says, neither of you have any value. We're not going to intervene. It's up to you to work it out on your own, which in most cases, if you knew how, you'd have done so. If the bully knew how, they would have done so. If the culture knew how, they would have done so. So the disease is one of valuelessness, and the disease is one of ignorance, and the disease is one of shame, and the disease is one of fear, of trauma, and incompetence. So there's an incompetence in the entire circle. And what cowards do is they give the full weight of the cult's problems to the most vulnerable people, the women, the children, the small people, the poor people, the minorities. They basically get handed the full weight of the culture's incompetence, that the culture, in shame and in fear and in overwhelm and incompetence, is saying, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this. You deal with it. And the only people that don't have the ability to shove it back in the face of the idiots trying to give it to them are the most vulnerable, the young, the children, the minorities. But we're doing this exploration for grown-ups, right? So, you're over the age of 18, you've got some degree of rational brain, you're in this loop. Now, how do you get out? Because this is a tricky thing, because obviously you can't copy or watch the bully unless you want to become the bully. That's the natural progression of things, is you go from victim to perpetrator. And you have to then look around for someone smaller and weaker and more marginalized than yourself, and then you dump all of your cultural abuse onto them and let them figure it out, right? Like the poorest, most marginalized, unhealthy, and traumatized individual is going to solve what an entire culture refuses to solve. It's a ridiculous equation, and so it's the symptom of a culture that doesn't love and value itself. A cult that loves and values itself does not give its biggest problems to the people least capable of dealing with them. An incompetent, shame-based, fear-based cult does that and fails because they don't solve them. They just become perpetrators, right? And so it's a loop. It goes round and round and round. How do you get off? How do you get off the loop? Well, one of the paths is in the identity of a victim. So I am the victim, and I'm going to look for help, and I'm going to protest, and I'm going to challenge my perpetrator. Now, maybe the perpetrator is competent enough to treat people that they're afraid of or intimidated by or who are challenging them well. They thought they could treat you poorly because you looked like a pushover, and darn, you had some resolve. So there is a certain amount that you can give back to your abuser, not as an infant, not as an employee in a sick organization, but maybe as a citizen, a little bit to your politician, maybe as a citizen to your partner. You're not going to take this. They don't want to take the shame back. They don't want to deal with it. Okay, well, you as a grown-up can leave. It's just that you've got an identity, a victim identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that fits neatly with a perpetrator. So if you don't change the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being of a victim, you will just find another perpetrator, or they will find you. You're vulnerable because you fit with a perpetrator. A victim and a perpetrator fit. If there's no victim, there can be no perpetrator, right? If there's no perpetrator, there can be no victim. You can hold on the identity and not let it die, and then find just wait a few years, and then, there'll be another perpetrator. We clicked. We know how to relate. And there's a draw to that. There's a magnetism between the victim and the perpetrator because it's familiar to both the perpetrator and the victim. They both know, they both feel at home. They both feel reminded of their family. It is familiar. And so there's a magnetism towards the known. Oh, at least I know my role again. I do this, you shame and humiliate me, I feel terrible. Do you apologize? How do we do this role? But that's kind of a necessary dance. Now, in order for the bully to stop bullying, they have to change their identity. which means they have to step out into the unknown. And in a traumatized culture, the fear of the unknown is bigger often than the fear of repetitive abuse. So the bully might want to stop bullying, but they don't know who they are. Meaning when the abuse starts young, all that you know about yourself is you are a victim and now you're a perpetrator, or you were always the perpetrator, or whatever. You identified with the role so closely that in a non-transcendent culture where you never meet a self that is the witness of those parts, you're stuck thinking that that's who you are. I am a bully. What do bullies do? They bully things. Well, who do they find? People willing to be bullied, right? Okay, so that's what they've got to do, right? If they leave that role, they've got to question, who am I then? If I'm not a bully, who am I? And often the next role below the bully is the victim, right? So if I'm not the bully, then I am the victim. And I'm never going to be the victim again. So then that puts them back in bullying. And in a psychologically illiterate culture, they've got to look then for someone to bully so that they can be the bully instead of, what's worse is the helplessness of the victim, right? So that's a stuck bully's part in a psychologically illiterate culture. Now, the culture, of course, could understand the dynamic and intervene, but that also takes the culture into the unknown. Cults, the root word of culture, like to feel like they're staying the same. They don't want to change. Cultures don't like changing. They're afraid of change. Most cultures are traumatic responses of identity. We are this people. We're not this people. Well, if you ask us to change, it sounds like you're changing who we are. Now, you're changing the identity from a less healthy identity to a healthier identity. But in order to do that, the culture goes into the unknown. So the culture abandons the victim and the bully because they're afraid of change, because they're afraid of trauma. Traumatized people are terrified of the unknown because they were traumatized in a place they didn't understand that was the unknown. They're terrified of it. And you, of course, if you leave the victim identity, who are you then? Who are you if you're not the victim? I don't know. And in a psychologically and traumatically illiterate culture that is materialistic rather than transcendent, I've never met this part of me that is bigger than the wound, that is bigger than the identity. I'd rather stay in known terrain. Now, as a victim, you can try and bully back or negotiate or press or give back, and say, stop bullying me. But it has to happen on both sides. Many victims, many abusers invite bullying and abuse in some way. If you give someone a compliment, oh, you're so lovely, you're beautiful. Many people, this is upsetting to them because it's breaking their identity as an unlovable, shame-based person. So they say, no, I'm not beautiful. They'll fight you, basically, if you try and invite them into an identity in which they're beautiful and powerful. No, I'm not beautiful, I'm not powerful, and I'm not going to change. Okay, so that's no fun, right? You try and compliment and praise someone, they block it. Okay, you go off, right? Now someone else comes along and says, you're a piece of shit. And you feel like, yeah, I am. So, then that sticks, right? I'm all engaged in that. So the identity clicks. Now, part of the challenge is you cannot fully transcend the victim identity as a victim. That's part of the challenge, right? Because for there to be a victim, there has to be a bully. So if my whole life is forever ruined by so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, all the people who are out to get me, and they're all out there, and they're bigger than me, well, then I'm a victim for life, right? And as a victim, there must then be periodic perpetrator to reinforce the identity so that I don't have to change, so that I don't have to go out into the unknown. So that's the crisis. Because if you believe the pain is too horrible and can't be fixed, you're in denial, right? It never happened. No, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to look at it, right? Then you look at it and you say, yeah, I was really hurt. This person really fucked me over. I've lost sleep over it. My health has deteriorated. This has happened. This has happened. My whole life has been damaged by this abuse. I am a victim. So now you're going from denial into the role. And that's an important progression. But at some point, somebody has to value you more than your perpetrators and more than the culture values you. If the culture valued you, you wouldn't have been abused within the container of the culture. If the bully or abuser valued you, they wouldn't have abused you. And if you had valued you and had the competence to honor your value, you would not be abused. It takes all three, and someone has to walk away from the game. And everyone's afraid to, because that takes you into the unknown. You are transcending the thing that the cult teaches you that you are. You are the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. That is the traumatized person. That is the abused person. But as an abused person, as the one who relives the abuse and thinks about the abuse and has all the symptoms of the abuse, even years after that particular bully has stopped doing that, now you're in a pattern, in a loop, whether it's PTSD or anything, you're in a loop of self-abuse. I remember, I put it back together, that was the abuse. I remember the terror, I turn away from the terror. I don't do this, I say I'm unlovable, I say it's helpless. And because I'm unlovable and because it's helpless, I won't go for this goal, I won't go for this relationship, I won't enjoy my day. So the abuse has become internalized into the identity. It is now an abuse identity, where whether you ever meet that abuser again the rest of your life, you are now in a psychologically illiterate culture that doesn't understand the technology of identity. You are now carrying the wound, the abused identity, and you can carry it the rest of your life, such that your identity, your bully did this thing one time to you at one point in this way, but you remember it and relive it and believe it and invest in it and react to it 10 million times, meaning you become the repeat offender. And part of the challenge that's so difficult around trauma is that helplessness is the most toxic thing around the bully trauma dynamic. And in order to not feel helpless, one of the things that children do is they hurt themselves. One of the things that victims do is they say, okay, you don't get to hurt me, I'll hurt myself first. What are they buying? They're getting control. So, you're moving from powerlessness of I'm powerless to defend against the abuse to I am powerful to abuse myself. But now I'm a bigger abuser of of myself through this abuse identity, this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, than my abuser ever was. And that's understanding that. And that's why I say if you're in a regressed state, you can't do anything about this. You need help with trauma. And in an incompetent culture, in a shame-based culture that particularly shames men for needing anything, which you do need help in trauma. So where do you go for that help in a traumatically illiterate culture? Well, maybe 10% of the therapists, 15% of the therapists are good. 85% are not. Maybe 10 or 15% of the people are healthier. They're not reinforcing that dynamic. Maybe they're healthier than you. You tell yourself and you tell them that you're a shit, And they say, no, you're not. You say, yes, I am. I'm such a shit. They say, no, you're not. But no one can convince you to shift your identity, your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. You have to face that crisis of helplessness, that fear of the unknown, and decide for yourself if you're going to give up on the abuse that was given to you and move forward. So the wheel collapses. A circle is an incredibly strong shape, very, very powerful. It's a triangle, right? It's a very strong shape. But if you walk away, if you stop participating, the circle collapses. It can't hold itself up without you. Then a new triangle, a new loop gets formed. It's just a different circle. The new circle is, I take care of myself and value myself. I surround myself with people that value me. And now the group and the circle sits on and does nothing about that, right? Now the circle, the culture, witnesses you loving yourself. So now a new triangle, a new identity is formed. But how do you do that? That's the challenge. Because in order to leave the victim identity, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is the abused identity, in order to leave that, you've got to treat yourself better than your abuser treated you, than you've treated yourself before, and that the culture treated you. How do you learn that when nobody's modeled that? Where does that come from? That's the crisis. Well, it comes from the unknown, the most terrifying fear of being willing to go out there, to venture a little bit into the unknown. And that is the crisis. Now, in my own sexual abuse by a therapist, obviously my therapist said, you're not worth protecting. And other people around the dynamic also said, yeah, you're not worth protecting. And I said, yeah, I'm not worth protecting. So there's a complete circle of valuelessness there. And my parents and my family, when I told them I've been abused, they did absolutely nothing. The message is, you're not worth protecting. So your family doesn't value you. My family doesn't value me. My therapists don't value me. They abuse me. I talked with the local district attorney. They didn't want to respond. Right? The government doesn't value and respond. And it's not personal, meaning my abuser is still abusing other people. They're not apparently valuable either. My abuser is not valuable enough to heal himself or to be healed, right? The culture is saying, you're not valuable. So everyone's communicating this message, it's not important. You're not valuable enough. So how do you step out? Now, unfortunately, the courts communicate the same message. I talked with an attorney and I noticed that he was activating trauma. And I said, have you sat down with a single psychologist? You say you want to help sexual abuse survivors win a court case. Yeah. Okay. And you bring in expert witnesses that are psychologists and trauma experts. Yeah. Have you ever paid any of them for an hour of training on how to do this intake form with me? He said, no. I said, it shows. You're doing it all wrong. Well, the attorney didn't like that. So he didn't want to take the case and admit that sexual abuse survivors were worth learning about. His message is, you have no value. Your case has value because money has value. I'm a capitalist in a capitalist cult. So if I can make a lot of money because you've been abused, I'll talk to you. But I'm not going to learn to competently support your being or communicate value, I'm not going to spend an hour. You think of that. What if pilots took this attitude? I want to fly a 747. Well, have you paid anyone for a single hour of training? Nah, I just want to fly one. It's like, you're nuts. You're absolute nuts. So when the message is ringing throughout the cult, you have no value, we have no value, you have no value, we have no value, your abuser has no value. And when the abuser is saying, you have no value, I have no value, because what kind of therapist ruins their marriage and their career by sexually abusing a client? Someone who has no value, right? Peter Sandhill, my therapeutic abuser, is screaming with a message that says, my career has no value. My marriage has no value. I have no value. You have no value. And the therapist covering up, for their student, they're saying the same thing. We have no value. You have no value. Peter has no value. And my parents are saying the same thing. I don't want to learn about trauma and this and that and the other. I don't want to learn how to be competent in this situation. You have no value. We have no value. It takes value for someone to transcend the abuse of valuelessness, right? And that's the crisis, because you can't learn it from idiots who are so entranced with the disease that they can't break out of it. So how do you get to know that you have value with a past you that says you don't, and past abusers that say you don't, and a culture that says you don't? How do you create that? Well, you can't do it as a victim. Why? Because to say that I am and will always be a victim is not a very rich life. I mean, would you say, wow, what would you do? How would you honor the most valuable person who ever existed? I think I'd give them an award of victimhood, right? You're the number one victim and always will be. It's like, that's not how you treat a valuable person. A valuable person isn't a victim. Meaning there's a stage of, working with that, but your primary definition is, I am the victim of, so-and-so's sexual abuse years ago. That's who I am. Why would you wish that on somebody? Why would you wish it on you, right? So that's the crisis. But then what's there instead? Where do you reach for? And that's the crisis. So, when I realized that the courts had the same message, you have no value, you have no value, you have no value. It starts with a 2-year cycle. Like, you want to get through this, but you're just a sexual abuse survivor. You have no value. We're going to draw this out and torture you for 2 years. Why? Because you have no value, right? So that's justice? To pay a lot of money to an incompetent attorney to dwell on this for 2 years so that your abuser can show up and remind everyone that you're not important? No, that wasn't a big deal. You're overstating, i.e. your feelings have no value. In a court system where they say don't talk about your feelings, why? They have no value. We're not interested in your feelings. We're interested in the law. The law has value. Yeah, but I'm here because the deepest wound is the message that I'm worthless. And that's what I'm trying to sort out here. I'd like to have some form of the culture say, no, this is wrong. Let's do it this way. Yeah, but we're not interested in that. We want to settle out of court and do this, we're interested in the money. We're not interested in your value. We're interested in the value of your case. We're not interested in your value. Well, that's nuts to spend 2 years with people like that. So it's it will go round and round with everyone agreeing that nobody has any value until someone, it could be the culture, it could be a judge, it could be an attorney, it could be a therapist, it could even be your abuser. Peter Sandhill could have done a lot of studying and said, you know what? I was wrong to do that. You do have value. I'm sorry, and I'm going to make it up in this way and this way. And, could have done all that. But if he had valued himself enough to feel that way, he wouldn't have done it in the first place, right? So it's a little bit of a catch-22 to look to the abuser who doesn't value themselves enough to stop abusing or to prevent their own original abuse that they're covering with the abuse. Because remember, perpetrators are going into the antithesis of their own wound. They don't want to feel their own valuelessness and their own helplessness of the original wound. And the best way they know how to do it is to transfer from the victim to the perpetrator that abused them. So they become their abuser. You can look at Israel towards the Palestinians, the helplessness of the Jews. They never want to feel that way again. So now they're bullying the Palestinians. They've become the perpetrator, but they don't want to own it. They're still the victim in their mind, right? Even as they're bullying, they're still the victim. Valuable people and countries and cultures don't do that. It's no fun to be in an endless loop. A culture that is unvaluable is in an endless loop of abuse. Now, how do you step out? How can any of us step out? Well, of the circle. Well, I've done all of it, meaning I've done protesting, I've explored my options, I've gone from silence and enabling my abuser to talking about it. Why? Because a more valuable person doesn't try and cover for their abuser, right? And so there's some relief in that, but I'm still a victim. Now, I've also studied psychology. My son says, no, we are worth studying this thing. This is an important science. And just because my entire cult says you're not worth teaching this science, okay, I'm going to learn it myself. I'm going to study psychology. I'm going to read these books. I'm going to become literate in the areas nobody valued me enough to teach me. I value myself enough to learn these things. So you can move towards education and knowledge. There's Audible books, YouTube videos, workshops, the odd therapist that really knows what they're doing in this. Because therapists can communicate the message you have no value as well. My first several therapists did, They listened to this, they took their fees. It's like, what? That's it? You're not going to help me press charges? You're not going to, no. We're not going to help other victims? No, they're not valuable, right? I'm not valuable, you're not valuable, we're not valuable. And the only reason I'm listening to you about your abuse is because you're paying me. Your money has value. So if we take away the money, you're not going to listen? Yeah, I'm not going to listen. Oh, you don't get it, do you? You're part of an abuse cult, and you think money is more important. You're not understanding your own value in this culture. So goodbye therapists, right? So where do you go when too many therapists are incompetent, right? And you try and tell people in the public, but they don't value themselves enough to do anything about it either, right? They're just hoping it won't happen to them and they don't have to think about it or remember their own abuse, because this isn't personal. So, the best path that I'm finding in this dynamic is to create a valuable life. So I've doubled my income. And, so one little check in the culture's, value system, and that allows me to create more freedom, more value. I've, challenged bullshit, and, I fired a crew that was exploiting me in this situation, stealing money and stuff. So fired the crew, got a more valuable crew. Holding standards. No, this is the job, right? And so making more money holding people accountable to agreements, getting rid of people that are communicating the message, you have no value, I have no value. It's fine, you're stuck in that message. But I do have value. You do too, by the way. But if you're not willing to behave that way, then out of my life, right? So ejecting people who are not willing to be medicinal around the core wound, which is valuelessness. And so, that's an important, challenge. Is there anyone willing to be in my life with a message of value? Right? So that's the thing. And the other thing is we can learn, we can grow. So growing new skills, learning more. These are expressions of value. Learning to speak more clearly. Like in the dating world, there's tons of laziness in the dating world. Why? Because there's tons of people who feel they have little or no value, And so how do you navigate that? How do you find someone that has real value? Well, you look at, what would a valuable person do in a dating relationship? Would they communicate thoroughly and effectively? Would they take time to become self-aware? Oh, you haven't done any of that. I can't learn value from someone who doesn't value themselves enough to even share who they are with a potential lover. So you can create filters. So, I've done that. Like one of my last filters in online dating was a 1 hour and 20-minute video in which I talked about a number of different things that I thought were important in a relationship. And I'm interested, does any woman value herself enough to want to learn useful things about a relationship before getting into bed? Or is she just a sex addict, right? Just do whatever I feel. I don't want to think. I don't want to study. I don't want to get... Well, not many are. But that's a filter, right? And I don't want to waste too much time with people that don't value themselves. And so, let's write a long profile. Let's create some work and then see who's excited. Who's excited that somebody valued themselves enough to do that? Well, not all that many. Okay, let them go, right? Don't take it personally that you're in a valueless culture, meaning a culture that is under the delusion that its psyche, that its self, that its essence has so little value, you can go cradle to grave in the culture without a single formal hour of psychological literacy, relational literacy, traumatic literacy, you name it. All the important things the cult completely ignores, if anything, shames and avoids, dealing with. So, that's a good place. Then with money, there's also ability to move, right? So I'm looking at different places in the world that value the kinds of experiences and technologies and interactions and identities that I feel are valuable, right? So looking at, is it, in Thailand, I'm 3 times happier. Would a valuable person maybe grow some of their own organic food locally? Would a valuable person be able to walk to work rather than go into traffic? So I'm looking at, 10x living in community. Now, a lot of the people I meet don't make time to talk about important things. They want to discuss trivia and politics and just dopamine hits over nothing, right? No deep, long-form conversations. Well, I want to have deep, long-form conversations. Well, what happens when a video camera is a better listener than almost anyone in your life? Well, you can talk to a video camera. You can talk to yourself. You can look in a camera and talk to that person in the camera and explore the topics you want to explore. So why? Because you're valuable enough to have good conversations with yourself, if no one else, right? And, what about health? What would a valuable person eat? Good, rich, organic food, yes, right? And what would a daily routine look like of a valuable person? Well, meditation has been incredibly useful because the universe is not as dumb as our cult. So you can connect with transcendent consciousness that is, thankfully, more intelligent than the people around you. Spend time with that. It's limited only to your imagination. Well, in a materialistic cult, imagination is devalued. But a valuable person doesn't listen to a psychologically illiterate, materialistic cult that reduces the universe to meaninglessness. A valuable person doesn't listen to such idiots. So value your own imagination anywhere. So you can take steps to increase your value, whether that's make more money or do more useful things or get rid of people that are, pulling the value down. And you can start co-creating. So what are valuable dreams? The most exciting dreams that I can think of are about living in a 10x community. Okay, so obviously the cult didn't have value itself enough to create that, but you can start to design that. It's a there's thousands of small steps daily to meditate in the morning, meditate in the evening, prepare a nice organic dish, increase the quality of your talent, your skill, charge more money for that skill, buy more things and experiences that create more value. Because suddenly, somewhere in those 1,000 steps where you value you, and see, here's the crisis. It doesn't work mathematically to say to the cult that doesn't value itself or you, to say to your abuser that doesn't value themselves or you, you should value me because I'm valuable. You should value me more than you value yourself. And you should value me more than you've been valuing me, because you should believe in my value. But why aren't you doing the 1,000 things that show that you believe in your value? If you don't develop your talent, if you don't develop your income, if you don't develop your health, if you don't develop your routine, if you don't develop your diet, and throw all of those lies out the window and say, no, you all may think that you and me and everyone around us are so worthless that we don't deserve psychological literacy. But I disagree. I'm going to become psychologically literate. You may all think that it's fine that I commit suicide or do this or that, but I disagree. You may think it's fine to show carelessness around communication, but I disagree. I set the standard, number one. But do I believe, right? How do you develop belief? By action. If you believe that you are valuable, you take steps to improve your sustainable well-being. If you do not believe you are valuable because you cannot, meaning you don't believe that you're valuable, and you cannot change that belief, well, then you're in the exact same bind as your abuser and your cult, because they don't think you're valuable and they're valuable either, and they don't know how to change their beliefs that you're valuable. And they don't know how to treat you valuably because they don't know how to treat themselves valuably. So if you don't know how to do it, why should they? It's a good question. They're members of an abuse cult as well. You're members of an abuse cult. They were abused. You've been abused. And if you can't figure out how to start treating yourself well, then why and how should they be able to figure it out? because they didn't learn from any better teachers than you did, right? You're in the same boat. You're part of the same cult. However, if you will do the 1,000 little steps, a little bit of breath work, a little bit of meditation, a little bit of writing, watching a great movie, going out for a walk, writing some goals, achieving the goals, eating another bit of great food, challenging someone to do what they said they were going to do, to live up to their agreement. If you will do those things repeatedly, you will show yourself how to value yourself. In the process, you will earn the belief that you are valuable, as demonstrated by all of the evidence. The cult, usually, because it's psychologically illiterate, just copies what everyone's doing. If someone says, I'm valueless, the cult just treats them valuelessly. If someone says, I'm really valuable, the cult says, okay, we'll treat you valuably. And in areas where one cult doesn't treat you valuably, you can go and live somewhere else. You know, there are some people on the planet that are capable of value. But if they value themselves, you also have to earn an approach. Meaning a really valuable surgeon that's focused on doing the best surgical work in the world, if you want to approach that surgeon as a patient, you're going to have to pay more money than a crappy surgeon who's likely to kill you, number one. But if you didn't value yourself enough to earn the money to pay the higher fees, you can't approach as a client. Now, if you want to be the surgeon's assistant, and the surgeon wants to be the best in the world, you have to be one of the best assistants in the world. How are you going to do that? You're going to have to earn the value by studying better than other assistants. Now you can approach a valuable person because you believe it and you've acted on it. Now here's the magical piece at the end. You've taken your 1,000 steps. Your world is now brighter, better, more valuable than the world of your perpetrator. Perpetrating is not high value. For them to abuse you means they have a lack of self-value. They may or may not have lots of money as a compensation for not actually valuing who they are, in a cult that tells them that they have no value, that only their money has value. So you have some people that don't believe they have a shred of value, but they're billionaires because they're desperate to compensate for that valueless, but they haven't learned to be valuable. They're not enjoying their life. They're not honoring their feelings. They're just passing on the abuse and feeling shame and guilt and fear about it, which is not fun or valuable as a billionaire or as anyone else, or as an addict. You can addictively manage the pain. So here's the end, though. Remember the circle. So you've got to not value yourself. Your abuser has not valued you, and everyone stands by and says, that's fine. That's the way the world is. But in the process of doing all these steps, you're stepping outside of the realm of a valueless abuser. And so these two little, lines here, they collapse. They fall down flat. It no longer affects you. It's not a gripping system anymore. What's more, if you're eating better food than most people, certainly your abusers and the average cult member of an unhealthy cult, if you're eating better food, if you're making more money, if you're learning more skills, if you're becoming more aware, if you're forming better friends than average, if you're having better conversations, whether they're in your diary, writing books, or whatever, or creating media, if you're creating grander visions, if you're investing in your future, if you're going on beautiful walks, If you're spending time with, one of my steps was, a lovely dog. Dogs know how to be more affectionate than most Americans. So if you want a loyal, secure emotional attachment, statistically, you're better off with a dog than you are with an American. So spend a little bit less time with an average American, a little bit more time with a dog. Your well-being goes up. That's what a valuable person is tracking. Is my well-being going up? Now, if you consistently do 1,000 things, and I mean 1,000 things, brush your teeth, have a good night's sleep, prepare the thing, buy beautiful flowers, hire a housekeeper, do fun activities. If you consistently do valuable things, you're no longer a victim. How are you a victim if you're living a better life than most people around you? How are you a victim of your family if you're living a better life than your family? You realize the power as a grown-up, hopefully an adult, but as a grown-up, that at some level, not the moment of shock and surprise and unconsciousness, but at some level, and at some stage in the healing and the growth work, that nobody can chronically abuse us and destroy our lives. Only we can do that. Our abuser may say you have no value, but only we can believe it. And if we believe it, we will abuse ourselves far more viciously than any abuser is capable of doing so, because a life feeling worthless and valueless is a miserable life. But if you know your value, even if someone occasionally hurts you, you can look at them with pity and empathy. You're still stuck in abuse and valuelessness. I'm sorry. That's your, if you want to learn, here are the steps. If you don't, I'm sorry you're stuck there. But I'm going to go spend time with people who know how to treat me better. And I will, because I'm backing it up with my own belief. In a capitalist cult, it takes money to immigrate or move or create a beautiful villa that's in a beautiful... It takes a certain amount of money. So get really good at something. And then work for people who admire and appreciate that. And be successful. It's hard, and I'm in some ways this video is a little bit of an honoring or a celebration. I'm turning away work. I've never made so much money in my life. I've got more people wanting to hire me than I have time for. I have more investments and savings and dreams than I've ever had. I've got a nicer home than I've ever had. I've got a lovely dog that I've never had. I'm eating better food than I've ever eaten. I'm enjoying my drives and music and media more than I ever have. And I'm looking to make that 10 times better. I'm dreaming and working daily to make that 10 times better. Now, when I'm doing all of that, and that's just a beginning, and I'm committed to doing more, am I a victim? No, I'm a winner. Am I a survivor? Only when I think about it, right? That's not where my focus is. Because to survive, you have to then remember and focus again on this and that and the other. But to win, I don't need to remember any of these things, except where they're useful, except like I want to create more empathy. So my story is useful. If I meet someone in a traumatized state, my history can allow me to win with that person more than if I didn't remember it. So it still has some use as a winner, right? To succeed at remembering, that's what they're going through. I remember that place and I know how to get out of it. Do you want to get out of it? Okay, that's fine. But it's useful for me, right? So I don't feel like a victim today. I don't feel like a survivor today. I feel like a winner today. That's 6 years of thousands of individual choices that each propel my life up and up and up and up and up. Gets knocked down, work on it, solve it. Gets knocked down, work on it, solve it. 1 step backwards, 2 steps forwards. Thousands of times. Because when you understand that the crisis is a disease of valuelessness, and you understand that the disease is contagious and it's all around, then you understand that if you don't solve the disease, it will define you, it will run your life. You will be affected by it. But if you can heal the disease, you're no longer the victim of the person who gave you the disease. If someone gave you AIDS and you can't solve AIDS at all, and you live a miserable life for the rest of your life with AIDS, why wouldn't you be bitter and miserable and angry and hurt? But if you can solve it, and now are living a great life, and that's where, how do you do that? What helps? What do you do? That's the path towards value. And once you have a more valuable life than your abusers, your family, whatever it is, your cult, you're no longer a victim. It doesn't make any sense. How am I a victim? And you can even look at things like, if I hadn't been traumatized, I probably would not have become traumatically illiterate. So I'm winning in spite of, but I'm also winning because of the abuse patterns that were given to me. And I understand it more.